So I was going to summarize the essence of what Greg and I have concluded on orality would be this: that in the early 20th century, what we would call, I suppose, a more liberal approach to the Gospels concluded that during the oral period, the time between Jesus and the writing of the Gospels, that there wasn't much concern for preserving the words of Jesus. Rather, what the real concern was being able to meet the problems of the early Christian community, and therefore, when a presenting problem arose, trying to imagine what Jesus would have said, and sort of creatively coming up with things Jesus said, and then saying, yeah, Jesus did say that. In response to that, more conservative scholars who were trying to really defend the reliability of Scripture were saying no. The Gospels faithfully present what Jesus said, and therefore, for whatever oral period there was between Jesus and the Gospels, there must have been continuity, preservation of what Jesus said. And yet, the way they defended that, much like the way the more liberal scholars were sort of undoing that, what held them both together, the conservatives and the liberals through the 20th century, was both of them were working off a highly literacy-based way of thinking about communication, and even thinking about an oral tradition in the way we modern academics think about literacy. What's happened really with this new wave of oral tradition studies or orality studies is trying to rethink the whole issue in terms that an ancient oral people would have done that. And I would say here's two main things that we believe we've seen that kind of change the game on this. One, oral peoples were very community-based, communal. They didn't have the rugged individualism that's forged the modern world. Rather, they found their own personal identity in their community and in their community's identity. You could call this the corporate solidarity of ancient peoples. And it continues to this day in cultures that are not deeply invested in the Enlightenment mentality of the modern West. But it's communal based. It's the fact that our identity, our shared identity, is what defines each of us individually. And therefore the stories of the community become absolutely important to each person's sense of personal identity. In that context, the oral traditions of a people, let's say early Christianity, become absolutely essential to defining for each individual who I am, who we are, and what our purpose in life here is. And so what we now realize, I think, what we have to acknowledge, is that early Christians would have held their oral traditions as identity forming, and therefore would have had a real concern to preserve and have custodians around that preservation taking care of their oral traditions. Teachers become a very important consideration. If you look at Paul's understanding of teacher in the New Testament, one of the key concerns is they can take what was passed on to them and hand it on to others faithfully. This makes absolute sense in oral cultural contexts. It's how you keep communal identity strong. More liberal perspectives of the 20th century did not see the importance of that to an oral culture. On the other hand, we also have to realize, and this is where maybe 20th century conservative approaches can learn something too, is that ancient peoples did not have the same precision standards that we in the modern literate West have. We would see contradictions, for example, in places they wouldn't say were contradictory, because they had a more flexible ability in oral tellings for saying the same thing in different words. For them, what was not important was saying the same words. What was important is saying the same gist or essence or the continuity of the tradition. Because when you speak orally as opposed to verbatim, having written texts, the verbatimness is not what's important. Rather, it's the essence of the message. And so they found multiple ways to tell the same message, the same basic story of Jesus. I believe that's why we have 4 Gospels and not 1. I think if a literate modern mentality had been guiding the early church, there would have been a counsel to say, how do we boil this down to 1 Gospel? Not for them. There were equally plausible ways, with the diversity of Matthew, Mark, and Luke, and John, telling the very same story. That's the flexibility of ancient oral cultures, but it's interesting, all of them still believed there's 1 gospel, the gospel of Jesus Christ. They were simply giving their, what we might call, oral performance in writing of the 1 gospel of Jesus Christ. And that's the balance I think we need to strike, is a strong custodial sense of the story of Jesus, and yet the ability in an oral culture to creatively and flexibly retell that story in different ways for different audiences at different times for different purposes, but it's always the same story.